picture the ultimate symbol of American freedom and resilience, right? You're probably imagining someone carved in marble, born with this profound sense of destiny, just marching a straight, triumphant line right into the history books.
Yeah, that's the standard textbook version for sure.
Exactly. But now take that image and imagine that same man so incapacitated by severe clinical depression that he's microdosing highly toxic mercury pills just to get out of bed.
Which is terrifying when you understand what mercury does to the brain.
Right. And imagine a man who lost almost every single election he ran in for decades. Someone who had a literal prophetic nightmare of his own assassination just days before it happened.
It's a completely different picture than the marble statue.
It really is. So today we're taking a massive stack of sources. We've got historical records, some really deep biographical analyses, and we're unpacking the gritty, surprising reality of the 16th U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
Our mission for this deep dive is to extract the deeply human strategies that allowed a man born in, literal dirt poverty to somehow save a fracturing nation.
It is such a critical perspective to take, because the version of this historical figure that we get in standard education, it often completely glosses over the profound darkness he had to navigate.
Yeah, they totally sanitize it.
Exactly. So to really understand what's at stake in these sources, we first need to look at the incredibly volatile landscape he was stepping into. The United States in the mid-19th century wasn't 50 United States.
Not at all.
It was a deeply divided house on the absolute brink of collapse.
Right. The idea of 50 cohesive states wasn't even a concept yet. You're looking at a country that is just tearing itself apart at the seams.
You essentially had two entirely different economies and cultures sharing a single border. The Southern economy relied heavily on the institution of slavery to power this massive, lucrative cotton industry.
While the North was doing something completely different.
Right. The North was largely free of slavery and was industrializing really rapidly. So these cultural and economic tensions have been boiling for decades.
Just a total powder keg.
Exactly. And when a fiercely anti-slavery president was finally elected, it was the ultimate spark. It ignited the Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, and, it remains the bloodiest conflict in American history.
So to even begin to understand how one person could shoulder the psychic weight of a nation engaging in a massive civil war, we have to look at how he survived a childhood that, honestly, it seems like it was engineered to completely break him.
It really was uniquely difficult.
The sources take us back to 1809. To a tiny one-room log cabin at Sinking Spring Farm in Kentucky. And we are talking about extreme, grinding frontier poverty here.
Surviving childhood on the frontier was an accomplishment in itself, but his situation was compounded by severe early trauma. His mother died when he was only 9 years old.
Wow, only 9.
Yeah. And that kind of sudden foundational loss, it leaves a permanent mark on a person's psychological development. And the friction in his life only intensified with his father, Thomas.
The relationship with his father is just fascinating to read about because Thomas essentially viewed his son as an economic asset. He wanted him to focus entirely on manual labor to help the family survive.
He had no time for his son's intellectual pursuits.
None at all. He actively discouraged reading. In fact, according to the records, his family and neighbors actually considered him lazy. They labeled him a shirker of physical labor because he always had his nose buried in a book.
The disconnect there is just striking. His family saw a kid avoiding his chores, actively avoiding the axe and the plow, but they completely failed to recognize the immense intellectual foundation he was building.
Right. His saving grace was his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston. She came into his life after his mother's death, and she recognized his raw intellect right away.
She was really a pivotal figure for him.
She actively encouraged his self-education despite his father's protests. And, reading about this period of his life, it makes me think of that famous quote attributed to him.
Oh, about the tree.
Yeah. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe.
It is the perfect encapsulation of his entire methodology.
Right. It reminds me of, a modern tech startup founder in stealth mode. You see someone spending years in a garage writing code, not making a single dime.
And everyone thinks they're crazy.
Exactly. Society looks at them and says, get a real job, you're wasting your life. But what looks like laziness to the outside world is actually deep foundational preparation. He wasn't avoiding work. He was spending his youth sharpening his axe.
That's a great way to put it. And that intellectual preparation was entirely necessary. But, when he finally left home at age 22 and moved to the frontier town of New Salem, he quickly found out that reading books doesn't keep you from getting beaten up.
No, it definitely does not.
He took on odd jobs, working as a shopkeeper and a postmaster. And he earned the famous nickname Honest Abe, because he was incredibly meticulous about strictly paying off his debts down to the last penny.
Which is great. But intellectual honesty alone wasn't enough to survive the brutal reality of a frontier town. You had to prove your physical mettle.
You really did.
Which brings up an anecdote from the sources that completely subverted my expectations. The wrestling match.
Oh, this is a classic story.
Right. So he's this tall, gangly guy, and he gets challenged to a fight by the leader of the local ruffians. Basically, the town bullies. Now, in a movie, this is the moment where the hero surprisingly easily defeats the bully, and the whole town cheers.
But the reality was much grittier.
Yeah.
He fought fiercely, but he actually lost the match.
Wait, he loses.
He does.
But the critical detail is how he lost. He took a horrific physical beating without ever backing down or showing fear. He fought so bravely that he earned the intense, lifelong loyalty of those exact same ruffians.
Which paid off massively later on.
Right. Those bullies later became some of his most ardent and aggressive political supporters.
It demonstrates a very sophisticated truth about human nature and leadership. People don't just respect victory, they deeply respect resilience. And that resilience formed the bedrock of a very unique superpower that he wielded throughout his political career.
Which was?
His complete lack of ego regarding his origins.
Oh, yes. The sources share a story that perfectly captures this superpower in action. Years later, he's president, and an opposing politician tries to publicly humiliate him in a political setting.
Which was a huge mistake on the politician's part.
Total miscalculation. The politician stands up and aggressively mocks him, saying something along the lines of, "Let's not forget, your father used to make shoes for my family."
The opponent is attempting to weaponize his dirt-poor origins against him, trying to shame him into submission.
And instead of getting defensive or angry or trying to downplay it, he just completely owns it. He responds by proudly stating that his father put his absolute soul into his work and that no one could ever make better shoes than his father.
Think about the psychological mechanics of that response. He weaponized his own perceived low status. By refusing to be shamed by his poverty, he completely disarmed his opponents.
Because you simply cannot insult a man who is fiercely proud of the very thing you're trying to insult him with.
Exactly.
I love that. But as much as we're talking about his brilliance, I have to step back and question the whole unstoppable hero narrative, because reading through this biographical analysis, the sheer volume of failure this man experienced is absolutely staggering.
It's hard to comprehend, honestly.
We call him the Great Unifier, but for most of his life, he was basically a walking political tragedy.
The timeline of his electoral defeats is indeed extensive and, deeply humbling.
I mean, he lost elections for the state legislature, he lost a bid for speaker, he lost races for Congress, he lost races for the Senate, he even lost a bid to become vice president. You are looking at a man who endured decades of massive public rejection.
And that public rejection was continually mirrored by agonizing personal tragedies behind closed doors. The sources detail the rumored loss of his first love, Anne Rutledge, to typhoid fever.
Just devastating.
And he later marries Mary Todd, a woman from a wealthy background who, according to historical records, could be highly volatile and difficult. They had 4 children together. Tragically, only one of those children, Roberts, survived to adulthood.
The grief of burying 3 of your own children while simultaneously losing election after election, it is almost unimaginable. How does a person's mind not completely fracture under that kind of pressure?
Well, in many ways, his mind did fracture. The combination of intense political stress and compounded personal grief led to severe, debilitating clinical depression.
Which they called melancholy back then, right?
Yes. And to cope with this immense psychological pain, he turned to the medicine of the era. He was prescribed a very common medication at the time called blue mass.
The medical realities of the 19th century are just terrifying to me. What was actually inside a blue mass pill?
The primary active ingredient in blue mass was mercury. High, concentrated levels of it.
Wow, which we now know is a highly potent neurotoxin.
He was essentially microdosing a deadly poison every single day. And the sources detail the severe side effects he began to experience. The mercury made him highly aggressive, erratic, and prone to explosive, uncharacteristic bursts of temper.
But the truly remarkable part of this detail is his self-awareness. He recognized what the drug was doing to his mind.
Which is so rare when someone is dealing with substance issues.
Right. He saw how it was warping his personality and his emotional control, and he made the conscious decision to completely stop taking the pills.
Given the addictive nature of medical treatments at the time and the sheer crushing weight of the depression he was trying to treat, stopping that medication required incredible internal fortitude. He knew he needed a completely clear mind for the storm that was gathering.
And that storm broke in 1860 when he finally won the presidency. Now, the sources make it clear that he had hated the institution of slavery for years.
Wrote deeply.
Yeah, early in his life, he took a trip to New Orleans where he witnessed the horrific, inhuman treatment of enslaved people being bought and sold in markets. It permanently scarred his worldview.
It was a defining moment for him.
But here's what confuses me. When he finally wins the presidency, and he actually has the power, he doesn't immediately demand the end of slavery.
And that decision deeply confused and angered many of his most ardent supporters. The abolitionists wanted immediate, sweeping action. But we have to look closely at the political tactician at work here. Upon his election, he received over 10,000 death threats.
10,000.
The country was sitting on a hair trigger.
So the man remembered as the great emancipator actually kept relatively quiet on the issue of abolishing slavery for the first 2 years of the Civil War.
He did. It was a masterful, though deeply agonizing diplomatic maneuver. He understood the complex political map. He knew that if he immediately declared the core purpose of the war was to end slavery, the border states, which were states that legally allowed slavery but hadn't yet officially seceded from the Union, they would immediately panic and join the Confederacy.
Ah, I see. So compromising on the issue he hated most was a necessary manipulation to keep the country from instantly dissolving entirely.
Precisely. His primary immediate objective had to be keeping those border states in the Union fold. He needed their manpower and their geographical buffers. Only once he had secured the military and political leverage could he begin to systematically dismantle the institution of slavery.
The tipping point, of course, was his election in 1860. The Southern states, fearing his long-term anti-slavery agenda, began to secede. They eventually formed the Confederate States of America, comprising 11 states, because they believed their entire economic survival depended on slavery.
And this fracture plunged the nation into the Civil War. It was a brutal, grueling conflict that cost an estimated 700,000 lives.
Such a staggering number.
And to manage an unprecedented crisis of this magnitude, he had to expand the powers of the presidency far beyond anything the founders had likely imagined.
He wasn't just a politician anymore. He was a wartime leader. I mean, he acted directly as commander-in-chief. He ordered massive naval blockades of Confederate ports without waiting for congressional approval. And most controversially, he suspended habeas corpus,
which is a massive expansion of executive authority. For context, suspending habeas corpus essentially meant that the government could arrest and indefinitely hold suspected Confederate sympathizers or spies without ever giving them a trial or bringing them before a judge.
Which is a wild amount of power. But he understood that the survival of the Republic required decisive, deeply controversial action. And then his patience finally pays off. In 1863, he plays his masterstroke, the Emancipation Proclamation.
This is a huge turning point.
This is where he finally takes the gloves off and makes the end of slavery a core stated goal of the war effort.
It served a profound moral purpose, obviously, but we also have to recognize it as a piece of brilliant foreign policy. By making the war officially and explicitly about ending slavery, he effectively blocked European powers from getting involved.
Specifically Britain, right, because they relied heavily on Southern cotton for their textile industry.
Exactly. The South was banking on Britain stepping in to help them keep the cotton flowing. But Britain had already abolished slavery, and the British public was fiercely anti-slavery. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he ensured that the British government could not politically afford to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy, because doing so would mean openly fighting to support slavery.
Wow. So he prevented a domestic civil war from escalating into an international proxy war just by shifting the stated goal. Incredible.
It was a genius move.
And later that same year, in 1863, after the bloodiest battle of the entire conflict, he delivers the Gettysburg Address.
Arguably the most famous and influential speech in American history.
But the detail from the sources that absolutely shocked me was the length of the speech. It was only about 2.5 minutes long.
Very brief.
In fact, the speaker who went on right before him, a man named Edward Everett, spoke for 2 solid hours. And people in the press actually mocked the president at the time for being too short, calling the speech underwhelming and inappropriate for the gravity of the event.
It is a phenomenal reminder that contemporary reactions to historical events are very often completely wrong. He didn't need 2 hours of flowery rhetoric. In 2.5 minutes, he entirely redefined the American purpose.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people. A phrase that went from being mocked in newspapers to becoming the absolute core philosophy of global democracy.
And he cemented that philosophy legally 2 years later, in 1865, with the agonizing push for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery forever in the U.S. Constitution. But what's crucial to understand here is the tactical reality of how he got it passed.
Because passing a constitutional amendment isn't just about having good ideas, you need numbers. And the sources highlight that he managed to secure votes from 23% of the opposition Democrats.
Yes.
How do you get your fiercest political rivals to vote for your most controversial legislation?
He used every single tool at his disposal, including heavy political patronage.
Which is basically bribery, right?
Well, patronage in the 19th century essentially meant offering lucrative government jobs like lucrative postmaster positions or customs posts in exchange for political loyalty and votes. He horse-traded, he persuaded, and he applied immense political pressure. He understood that a constitutional amendment required a mandate that crossed party lines, and he was willing to get his hands dirty in the legislative mud to secure those votes.
So he successfully navigates this massive national tragedy. The Confederacy surrenders in 1865 after a ruthless final military campaign. The 13th Amendment is secured. The nation is officially saved.
A monumental achievement.
But the deeply unsettling part of this story is that the venomous hatred he had inflamed in his enemies over the course of the war converges into a terrifying, hyper-focused plot against his own life.
The assassination at Ford's Theater.
The sources describe how this final act actually starts with something almost supernatural, a premonition. 3 days before the assassination, he has a terrifying nightmare.
Yes, he dreamt he was wandering through the empty halls of the White House. The building was completely silent except for the distinct sound of someone weeping softly.
He follows the sound of the crying into the East Room. He walks in and sees a body laid out on a platform covered entirely in a white sheet. He asks a military guard standing nearby, "Who is dead in the White House?" And the guard replies, "The president. He was killed by an assassin."
It is a chilling detail. Particularly when you realize how meticulously the real physical plot was already being formed in the waking world by a man named John Wilkes Booth.
Booth was a famous, highly successful stage actor at the time, and he absolutely despised the president, specifically for his recent efforts to extend voting rights to Black Americans.
His hatred was intense.
The sources outline the master plot for the night of April 14th, 1865. This wasn't like a random crime of opportunity. It was a trap planned with terrifying precision.
Because Booth was a seasoned actor, he knew the physical layout of Ford's Theater inside and out. It was his domain, and he used that spatial knowledge to his advantage.
The tactical preparation of the crime is startling. Earlier that day, Booth sneaks up to the presidential viewing boxes, box 7 and 8. He uses a small, screw-like tool to drill a tiny peephole straight through the door.
Very calculated.
Then he stashes a specific wooden stick nearby,
Right.
measuring it perfectly so he can jam the outer door shut from the inside once he enters the hallway.
He was engineering an enclosed, inescapable space.
Yeah.
But for a trap like that to actually work, he needed the presidential security to fail completely.
And it failed catastrophically. The cascading errors are just frustrating to read. Originally, General Ulysses S. Grant, the top military commander, was supposed to attend the play with the president's party, which would have meant heavy, aggressive military security.
But Grant canceled.
Right. And on top of that, the president's regular, highly trusted bodyguard, a man named Crook, actually begged him not to go to the theater that night.
But the president, likely deeply weary from years of relentless war and just wanting a normal evening out with his wife, waved off the concern.
So instead of his trusted bodyguard, a replacement guard is assigned to protect him, a man named John Frederick Parker. And where is Parker when the most famous actor in America is sneaking up the stairs to the president's box?
He had actually abandoned his post at the door.
He abandoned his post to go to a nearby bar and get a drink with the president's driver. I mean, he left the door completely and utterly undefended.
It's a devastating failure. And this is where Booth's intimate knowledge of the theater becomes lethal. He easily enters the outer door, uses the wooden stick to jam it shut against the wall exactly as he planned, and then looks through the peephole he had drilled earlier that day.
He's looking at the back of the president's head, but he doesn't shoot immediately. He is waiting for a very specific moment in the play, a comedy called Our American Cousin. Because he's an actor, he knows exactly when the single biggest laugh line of the show happens.
He timed his shot to coincide perfectly with the audience's laughter. He used the roar of the crowd to muffle the distinctive sound of his Derringer pistol.
He slips in, waits for the massive laugh, and shoots the president in the left temple.
Chaos instantly erupts in the confined box.
Major Henry Rathbone, a military officer who was attending the play with the presidential party, instantly lunges at Booth. But Booth is prepared for a fight. He slashes Rathbone deeply in the arm with a heavy hunting knife, fights his way to the edge of the box, and leaps from the balcony down onto the main stage.
But in his dramatic escape, the theatricality of the space actually betrays him. His riding spur catches on an American flag that had been draped over the front of the balcony for decoration.
Because the spur catches, he lands awkwardly on the stage and severely fractures his leg. Yet even with a broken leg, he manages to limp out the back door, jump onto a waiting horse in the alley, and flee into Virginia.
He evaded capture for 12 intense days before Union soldiers finally tracked him down and killed him in a burning barn.
But the damage inside the theater was irreversible. The bullet wound was entirely fatal. Despite the frantic efforts of doctors who carried him to a boarding house across the street, the president succumbed to his wounds and died at 7:22 a.m. the following morning, April 15.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of his story. He had successfully outmaneuvered his political rivals. He had forced the Confederate States to surrender. He had held the country together through sheer unyielding force of will. But he didn't live to see the long-term fruits of a truly united nation.
He was a man who absorbed an unimaginable amount of public failure, profound personal grief, and literal physical toxicity. Yet, out of that relentless crucible, he managed to lay the unshakable foundation for modern American democracy.
So what does this massive stack of history actually mean for you listening to this deep dive right now?
That's the big question.
When you look at your own life, when you are facing what feels like an insurmountable mountain of rejections, whether in your career, your relationships, or your personal goals, remember that the man who saved the entire American project was a man who spent the first half of his life constantly losing.
Wow, yeah.
Failure wasn't a detour for him. It was his constant companion.
And that leads to a provocative thought I want to leave you with today. If a man carrying that much devastating personal trauma, chemical toxicity, and public humiliation could hold a fracturing country together, how much of our own modern anxiety, our own perceived weakness, might actually be the exact training ground we need to handle our greatest future challenges?
A very powerful shift in perspective.
What if your current struggle, your current string of frustrating failures isn't a sign that you are losing? What if it's just you spending 4 hours sharpening your axe?
A powerful question to ponder as we face our own frontiers.
It really is. The muddy, painful waters of a difficult life might just be the very thing that helps you see clearly when it matters most. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep sharpening that axe.